Happy New Year of 2025 and welcome back to Intel Focus, the review series. We're kicking off the year with a deep dive into a paper that really grabbed my attention.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's called How Do We Study Misogyny in the Digital Age? A systematic literature review using a computational linguistic approach.
Interesting title.
It gets right to the heart of how we even try to understand,
Hmm.
this really complex issue online.
Yeah, I see it's by Lara Fontanella, Berta Schulve, Elisa Ignazzi, Annalena Sara, and Alice Tantu Di Mama. What struck me is just how much research they tackled.
Really?
Yeah, over 2,800 articles from like 1990 all the way to 2022.
Wow, so they've been at this for a while.
Shows how much attention misogyny, especially online, is getting across so many fields.
Definitely feels like we're at a turning point. It's not just some fringe thing anymore. This is impacting tons of people.
Oh, absolutely. The paper actually shows this crazy trend.
What's that?
Research on misogyny has just exploded, especially after 2010. We're talking a yearly growth rate of 13.1%.
Yeah, 13.1%. What does that even mean?
Basically, the amount of research is doubling every 5 to 6 years.
Wow, that's a lot.
It's clear this issue needs serious attention.
Okay, so before we get too deep into it, let's make sure we're all on the same page here. The paper uses these terms, misogyny, sexism, and patriarchy, sometimes kind of interchangeably.
Right.
For someone who's, not super familiar, can you break down how those terms actually relate?
Yeah, for sure. The paper actually acknowledges that different fields use them in slightly different ways. Like in psychology, you often see sexism being used.
Right. Nice.
And they'll distinguish between hostile sexism, which is like very obviously negative towards women,
Uh-huh.
and benevolent sexism.
Benevolent sexism. That sounds kind of nice.
It can seem that way, but it's actually pretty tricky. It's like saying, oh, women are too delicate for this tough job, or women are natural caregivers, so they should be the primary parents.
I see, so it sounds positive.
Yeah, but it's still reinforcing those traditional roles and ends up limiting women's choices.
Oh, it's like a velvet cage or something.
Mm,
Looks
yeah.
pretty, but you're still trapped.
Exactly. And then there's patriarchy, which is used more in sociology.
Okay.
It's about the whole system, the structures and power that favor men, and that leads to gender inequality.
So where does misogyny fit in all this?
Misogyny is being used more and more in communication and computational sciences. Some researchers consider it like the extreme version of sexism.
Oh, okay.
They even call it the law enforcement branch of the patriarchy.
Law enforcement. That's an intense way to put it. What do they mean by that?
It's about controlling women, punishing those who don't fit traditional expectations. It's not just about, like, attitudes, it's about control.
Gotcha.
And the internet, unfortunately, has become a tool for that.
That is a chilling thought. So let's get into this whole digital shift. How has the internet, especially social media, changed things for misogyny?
Think of the internet as like a giant megaphone. It can amplify misogynistic content. It makes it easier to target individuals.
That makes sense.
And now with the internet, anyone can be both a perpetrator and a victim.
Yeah, the paper brings up Gamergate as this major turning point.
Right.
Remind us what that was and why it was so important.
Gamergate back in 2014 was this really awful online harassment campaign, mostly targeting women in the gaming industry. It was shocking how intense and widespread it was.
I remember.
It really showed the world how toxic these online spaces could be.
It's still wild to me that something that started as, a debate about ethics in gaming journalism could turn into something so hateful.
It really showed how quickly online platforms, especially the anonymous ones, can become breeding grounds for this stuff. And, Gamergate wasn't just a one-time thing.
Right.
We see similar patterns with female politicians, journalists, celebrities, really anyone challenging those traditional gender norms or stepping into spaces usually dominated by men.
It's like there's this backlash against women having more visibility and influence, and they're using digital tools as weapons.
That's a good way to put it. One thing the researchers did in this paper was analyze all that research, to find key themes in it.
Interesting.
They use something called topic modeling, which is basically clustering similar ideas from a huge amount of text.
So what did they find? What are the big buckets researchers are focusing on?
They came up with 12 key themes, like feminist perspectives on misogyny, how it's shown in literature and film, and how it connects to politics and masculinity. There's stuff on women's rights, sexual violence, online misogyny, of course, and even misogyny in music and religion. It's a lot.
12 themes. Wow, that's a wide range. Out of all of those, did any of them stand out to you as particularly I don't know, surprising or unexpected?
One of the most interesting things was the research on automatic detection of online misogyny is pretty disconnected from the other areas.
Really?
Seems like there's a big opportunity to get the folks developing these tools to collaborate with those studying the bigger social and cultural context of misogyny.
Why do you think that disconnect exists? It seems like those two areas could really benefit from each other, right?
Maybe it's because they use such different research methods, or maybe they just aren't aware of each other's work. But bridging that gap is super important.
Right.
Like, imagine if the people building AI to detect misogyny really understood the nuances of gender dynamics and how misogyny shows up online.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like trying to build a house without knowing anything about foundations.
Yeah,
You might end up with something that looks okay, but it's not going to be very strong.
exactly. So maybe let's dive into some of those specific research findings, starting with what sociologists have learned.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
So, sociologists have been doing some really interesting work, like digging into who's targeted, the groups behind it, and the methods they use.
So let's start with the targets. Who is really facing the brunt of this online hostility?
Well, it's unfortunately a pretty diverse group.
Yeah.
We're talking female politicians, journalists, celebrities, influencers, anyone in the public eye, really.
Right? They're kind of putting themselves out there.
But it also extends to women in specific online communities, like gamers, YouTubers, even university students are dealing with it.
Yeah, just trying to learn online. It's
Exactly.
almost like this online misogyny wants to push women back into these traditional roles by silencing them in public spaces.
It is a form of digital intimidation. It
Mhm.
aims to limit women's participation and influence. And that silencing can have real-world consequences for their careers, mental health, even their safety.
Yeah, it's serious stuff.
Mm.
You mentioned the groups behind the abuse. The paper talks about the manosphere. What is that exactly?
The manosphere is really a bunch of online communities, united by their anti-feminist views, and there are varying degrees of misogyny within them.
Huh.
It's a bit of a rabbit hole, honestly, with groups from, like, more moderate men's rights activists to the more extreme, kind of unsettling world of incels.
It's kind of disturbing to think that these communities even exist and are able to connect so easily online. Can you give us some examples of these manosphere groups and what they're all about?
Sure. Men's rights activists, or MRAs, they often claim that men are actually the oppressed gender.
Oh, wow.
They say they're victims of a society that favors women.
Huh.
They push this narrative of male victimhood, and that can be a gateway to even more extreme ideologies.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope.
And then you have the incels, short for involuntary celibates. They blame women for their lack of romantic success.
Right?
Their beliefs can be super toxic and even dangerous.
Yeah, I've heard about them.
Then there are the MGTOWs, men going their own way. They're a little different.
How so?
They basically advocate for complete separation from women. They say it's like a rational choice to avoid the drama and manipulation they perceive in relationships. But underneath it all, their ideology is still rooted in misogyny.
It's a pretty chilling spectrum of beliefs. It makes you wonder how they even recruit new members.
That's where online platforms come in. They give these groups the tools to create forums, websites, and social media groups. Essentially, they create these echo chambers where they reinforce their worldview and connect with others who think like them.
It's frightening how the internet can bring them together like that. So how do researchers even study these communities,
Yeah.
the content they produce?
It's not easy, but sociologists are using a lot of different methods. Discourse analysis, interviews, surveys, even digital ethnography.
Digital ethnography.
Yeah, it's like being a digital anthropologist, immersing yourself in these online worlds to understand their language, motivations, and dynamics.
Sounds like pretty intense work, but crucial to understanding and combating it. So what about the women who are targeted by this? How are they fighting back?
The paper highlights two main approaches: self-care and active resistance.
Okay.
Self-care is about minimizing harm and protecting yourself in toxic online spaces. This can mean using pseudonyms, strengthening privacy settings, or just limiting your exposure to certain platforms or content.
It's sad that women even have to do this.
It is.
It's like digital self-defense.
It speaks to the toll it can take. It's exhausting to be on guard all the time, censoring yourself, avoiding certain topics. But it's important to remember, self-care isn't giving up.
Right.
It's about protecting your well-being so you can still engage in active resistance.
That makes sense. So let's talk about active resistance strategies. How
Yeah.
are women challenging this head on?
We're seeing a rise of feminist counterpublics.
Oh, yeah.
They're using social media for education and activism.
Interesting.
They're creating these supportive online communities, documenting abuse, and challenging misogynistic narratives in public.
So they're basically reclaiming those spaces.
Yeah, there's a real sense of collective action. They're using different tactics, too. Some groups focus on education, using social media to debunk myths and stereotypes. Others use humor and satire to undermine the rhetoric.
I love that, using humor as a weapon.
It can be very effective. The paper mentions a tactic called mirroring, used by Mongolians in South Korea.
Mirroring, what is that?
Basically, they mimic the language of misogynistic groups but flip the roles.
Interesting.
So, they're holding a mirror up to the behavior. It exposes the absurdity and cruelty by making them the victims in their own rhetoric.
It sounds like a pretty clever way to make people confront their own words.
It's a bold move, and how effective it is still being debated.
I can see that.
Some say it can be divisive and even perpetuate the very language it's trying to challenge, but it definitely shows the creativity and resilience of women fighting back.
It does. So the paper also talks about computational approaches.
Mm-hmm.
Using tech to address this, it's a whole other level.
Yeah, this is where computer scientists come in. They're developing tools to automatically detect and flag misogynistic content.
It sounds almost sci-fi. AI fighting sexism.
It might sound futuristic, but it's happening.
Wow.
They're training algorithms on huge data sets of text and code, teaching them to recognize the little nuances of misogynistic language.
So you're basically teaching a computer to understand the difference between, say, a harmless joke and an actual harmful insult.
Pretty much, yeah. These algorithms can identify patterns of language that show intent, even if the words themselves aren't obviously offensive.
That's amazing. It's like giving machines a sixth sense for detecting this stuff. But how do you even teach a computer something like that?
It's complicated. You feed the algorithms huge amounts of data. Think of it like training a dog. You show them examples, and over time, they learn to see the differences.
Okay, I can kind of see that.
In this case, researchers are feeding them examples of misogynistic language.
So the more data you feed the algorithm, the better it gets.
Exactly. It becomes all about pattern recognition. The algorithm learns those subtle cues, the words, the tone, even the structure of the language.
That's fascinating. But what about the ethics? Are there any concerns with using AI like this?
Well, we have to be careful about bias. The data used to train these algorithms can reflect the biases of where it came from.
Of course.
So if the data is skewed, the algorithm could perpetuate that.
Yes, like if you only train your dog to recognize one kind of treat, it might miss all the other delicious ones.
Exactly. We need to make sure the data is diverse and representative, and that the algorithms are checked and refined to minimize bias.
So it's like this constant back and forth between humans and the machines.
Right. That's why collaboration between computer scientists and social scientists is so important. Social scientists can provide the context and expertise that the computer scientists need to develop truly effective and ethical tools.
It's like a team effort.
Absolutely. And this collaboration is key if we want to go beyond just detecting misogyny and move towards preventing it.
Preventing it, how is that even possible?
Well, imagine if social media platforms could actually identify and intervene in potentially misogynistic behavior before it even happens.
Oh, wow.
Imagine a system that could nudge users towards more respectful communication or flag content that's crossing the line.
That'd be amazing. It's like having a digital guardian angel.
It's ambitious, but researchers are working on it. They're developing tools that analyze patterns of online behavior and can see those early warning signs.
Like predicting the weather, but for online toxicity.
It's not perfect, but it has the potential to reduce how much we encounter.
That would be huge. In the meantime, what can individuals do to protect themselves and create safer spaces?
That's a great question, and one that we'll dive into in the final part of our deep dive.
So we've been looking at this whole complex world of misogyny in the digital age. It's deep-rooted in society, but it's amplified online.
And we've talked about how researchers from different fields are trying to understand it and fight back against it.
Right. But before we wrap up, let's talk about what individuals can actually do. It's easy to feel powerless, like our actions don't matter much.
I get that. It's a common feeling.
Yeah.
But it's really important to remember that individual actions, especially online where your voice can reach so many, can actually make a difference.
Okay, so what are some things we can do to push back?
The first thing is awareness. Just educating yourself about the different forms online misogyny can take. We often focus on the really obvious stuff.
Like what?
Like blatant harassment, insults, threats.
Right, that's the easy stuff to spot.
Yeah. But it's just as important to see the more subtle forms.
Like what? What are some examples?
Think about those like seemingly harmless jokes that actually reinforce stereotypes, or the dismissive language used to shut women down in discussions.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Or the constant objectification and sexualization women deal with online.
It's like death by 1,000 cuts. Each one might seem small on its own, but together is really damaging.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to speak up, even when it feels awkward.
Yeah.
Challenge those jokes, call out the language, support women who are targeted.
It's about saying that's not okay.
It's about creating a culture where it's just not tolerated, online or off.
Makes sense.
And it's not just speaking up, it's also about amplifying women's voices. Follow female creators, share their work, promote their perspectives. We need to diversify the online landscape and break down those echo chambers.
Right, so it's not enough to just not be a jerk.
Yeah.
You have to actively promote good stuff.
Exactly. And what about men? What role do they play in all this?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Men has a really important role to play because, well, let's be honest, misogyny is ultimately a problem of male behavior.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just not be a perpetrator yourself. You have to be an active ally.
So what does that actually look like?
It means calling out other men when they're being misogynistic, even if it's your friends or family.
Right, that's the tough one.
Have those uncomfortable conversations, challenge those beliefs, and hold each other accountable.
We need to have each other's backs.
It's about creating a culture of respect and equality.
Okay, I like that.
Okay.
And of course, listening to women, believing their experiences, and supporting their efforts.
Absolutely. Men need to use their privilege to help dismantle the systems that cause this.
So we've talked about individual things, but what about the bigger picture? What kind of changes need to happen to really address this?
We need stronger laws and regulations to hold people accountable for online harassment. Right now, it's way too easy to get away with this stuff online.
Yeah, you can hide behind anonymity.
Exactly.
And platforms need to do better, right? They need to take more responsibility for what's shared on their sites.
100%. They need better tools, better reporting, and more transparency. They have the power to create safer spaces, but we have to hold them accountable.
And beyond the platforms themselves, we need to change society too, right?
Right.
To get at the root of this.
We have to challenge gender stereotypes, promote equality, and create a culture where women are valued and respected, not just for their looks or if they fit into traditional roles.
That's a lot to work on.
It is, but it's essential if we actually want a world without misogyny.
I have to admit, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed after all this. Where do we even start?
It's totally understandable to feel that way. This is complicated and deep-rooted, but don't let it lead to despair.
Right.
Every action matters. No matter how small, it can help create a more just and equitable world.
So it's about channeling this energy into positive change.
Exactly.
Keep learning, keep pushing, keep fighting.
And don't forget about hope. Even with all the negativity, there are reasons to be optimistic.
Yeah. Like what?
Like, we're finally having these conversations.
It's true.
Research is shedding light on the problem and pointing us towards solutions.
Right.
There are more and more people dedicated to making things better.
And we have the knowledge and the tools to do something about it.
Exactly.
So let's keep fighting the good fight. Let's build a digital world where everyone can thrive without misogyny holding anyone back.
That's the future we should be striving for.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.